They thought she was invisible, a 76-year-old widow, alone in a small-town diner, quietly holding her coffee like it was the last warm thing she owned. When a powerful local bully decided to make an example of her, the room went silent. No one stood up, no one spoke. And in that frozen moment, one slap changed everything. Because he didn't know the truth. He didn't know her son was already on his way, and he had no idea that a battle-tested German shepherd, trained to protect the vulnerable at all costs, would be the first to step between cruelty and courage. What happens next will make you believe in quiet miracles and second chances for the forgotten. Before we begin, tell me where you are watching from. Drop your country in the comments below. And if you believe no child or animal should ever face fear alone, hit subscribe now and share this story with someone who needs hope. Cedar Falls, Montana. Sat where the Clearwater River cut a silver ribbon through dark pines and stubborn rock. In early October, the town wore autumn like a hard-earned medal. Gold aspens trembling on the hillsides, rust-red shrubs clinging to the banks, and a sky so clean it looked sharpened. But the beauty didn't soften the place. The wind came down from the ridgeline with a cold edge, sliding through the streets and around the corners of old brick storefronts, as if it owned them. Nights arrived early. Mornings smelled like wet leaves, wood smoke, and river stone. And even when the sun showed its face, it never promised kindness, only clarity. The people of Cedar Falls moved with that same clarity. They weren't rude, not exactly. They were simply economical, with warmth, as if affection were something you earned through years rather than minutes. Outsiders were noticed. New money was noticed even faster. A fresh car in a gravel lot or a new lock on a cabin door drew eyes the way blood drew flies. The town had its own rhythm, its own unspoken rules, and, like most small places that pretended to be simple, it had pockets where the rules were written in ink. No one admitted existed. Eleanor Brooks arrived on a Tuesday morning with a single suitcase and a knitted scarf tucked into her coat pocket like a talisman. She was 76, though she carried her years with a quiet, upright grace that made people guess younger until they saw the fine lines around her eyes. Her hair was white but not dull. It shone like fresh snow under daylight, pinned into a neat twist at the back of her head. Her face had the softness of someone who had laughed often and the steadiness of someone who had cried without letting the world see. She was of average height, slender without looking frail, and her skin held the pale warmth of a woman who had once spent decades standing in sunlight-filled classrooms. Her hands were the hands of a music teacher, long-fingered, careful, with faint calluses that never quite disappeared even after retirement. The taxi driver who dropped her off didn't say much. He carried her suitcase to the porch, nodded once, and left. Eleanor didn't mind silence. She had lived with it for years. After her husband Thomas died, heart failure on a March night that still visited her dreams like an old storm, silence became not an enemy but a housemate. Sometimes it was cruel. Sometimes it was a blanket. The cabin stood a mile outside town, perched above the Clearwater where the river widened and slowed, as if pausing to admire the landscape. It was newly renovated, but built to look like it had always belonged there. Cedar siding, black-framed windows, a stone chimney, and a porch that faced the water. The land around it was a long parcel of mixed pines and aspens, thick enough to feel private but open enough to see the river's glint through the branches. A narrow gravel drive wound from the road to the house, curving just enough to hide the porch from casual passers-by. It was, Eleanor knew, too perfect, too generous. Caleb had insisted. Her son's truck was already there, an older model Ford with mud-caked tires and a dented rear bumper like a story it refused to explain. Caleb Brooks stepped out as she climbed the porch steps. He was 38, tall and lean in a way that didn't read as thin so much as engineered. His shoulders were broad without being bulky, the kind of build that suggested strength used efficiently rather than displayed. His hair was dark brown, cut short, and his face was all angles, high cheekbones, a straight nose, a jaw that looked carved rather than grown. A faint, well-kept stubble shadowed his chin and upper lip. His eyes were a clear gray blue that could be gentle, but never careless. He wore a simple flannel shirt and worn jeans, and nothing about him advertised what he had been. Yet everything about him hinted at it. The quiet awareness, the stillness that wasn't, laziness, the way his gaze checked corners and windows as naturally as breathing. Eleanor felt her chest loosen at the sight of him. Love did that, made the body unclench even when the mind tried to remain practical. "There she is," Caleb said, and his voice carried warmth like a hidden flame, controlled but real. He stepped forward and hugged her carefully, as if she might break, though Eleanor knew that caution was his habit with everyone he loved. He pulled back, hands still on her shoulders, and studied her face the way a medic checked a patient without asking permission. "You okay? The ride wasn't too long?" "I survived," Eleanor replied, dry humor threading through her softness. "The driver drove like he was escaping the devil." Caleb's mouth twitched, almost a smile. "That's Cedar Falls hospitality. You'll get used to it." Then the third presence arrived without ceremony. Ranger. The German shepherd trotted out from behind Caleb's legs, large and sleek, his coat black and tan with a glossy sheen. He was 100 pounds of disciplined muscle, not the exaggerated bulk of a show dog, but the balanced power of a working one. His ears stood erect, his eyes dark and intelligent, and his movements were controlled as if every step had been voted on by his instincts and his training. A faded scar cut through the fur near his left shoulder, a pale line like an old chapter. Ranger stopped a few feet from Eleanor, sat, and watched her with intense calm. No barking, no jumping, no frantic affection. Eleanor's heart softened anyway. She had always loved animals, but she respected this kind of dog in a different way. Ranger wasn't just friendly. He was purposeful. "Hello, handsome," Eleanor said, lowering herself a little and offering the back of her hand for him to sniff, as she'd done with countless dogs in her life. Ranger leaned forward, sniffed once, then pressed his nose lightly against her fingers as if stamping approval. His tail gave a slow, controlled wag. Caleb exhaled through his nose, a quiet sign of relief. "He likes you." "I'm charming," Eleanor said, standing straight again, and for a moment the porch felt lighter. Caleb carried her suitcase inside. The cabin smelled new, fresh wood, clean linens, but also lived in, because Caleb had already stocked it. There were groceries in the refrigerator, a kettle on the stove, and a bowl of apples on the counter. Eleanor walked through the living room and paused at the wide window that framed the river like a painting. Beyond the glass, the clear water moved with a steady confidence, catching sunlight in bright flashes. A pair of ravens crossed the sky, black silhouettes against pale blue. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Caleb stood beside her, hands in his pockets as if he didn't know what to do with tenderness. "You deserve beautiful." Eleanor glanced at him and saw the faint tension behind his eyes. She knew that look. It was the look of a man who gave gifts the way others built walls, because protecting her felt more manageable than admitting he missed her. "You didn't have to do all this," she said gently. "I wanted to," he answered, simple as that, as if desire were reason enough. Then, after a beat, his gaze slid toward the road beyond the trees. "And I wanted you somewhere quieter, safer." Eleanor didn't press. She could tell when Caleb carried a thought he wasn't ready to share. She was his mother, not his interrogator. They spent the next hour unpacking. Caleb moved with efficiency, putting away dishes, checking locks, testing the porch light, adjusting the thermostat. Ranger followed him from room to room like a shadow that breathed. Eleanor watched with a mix of affection and worry. There was a gentleness to Caleb's care, but also an urgency, like he was preparing for weather rather than simply welcoming his mother to vacation. When the kettle whistled, Eleanor made tea and brought 2 mugs to the small dining table. Caleb sat across from her, elbows on the wood, fingers wrapped around the mug but not drinking. "So," Eleanor said, trying to tug the conversation toward lighter ground, "what does a man like you do in a place like this, besides hover?" Caleb's gaze lifted. "Rest," he said. Then, after a pause that suggested honesty was a muscle he didn't always like using, he added, "Or at least learn how." Eleanor smiled. "That sounds exhausting for you." He gave a real smile then, brief, but it reached his eyes. "It is." Outside, the wind shifted. A gust pushed through the trees and sent a scatter of leaves skittering along the porch boards. Ranger's head lifted, ears twitching. He stood and moved to the window, staring toward the drive. "What is it?" Eleanor asked, though she knew dogs sometimes listened to invisible conversations. Caleb rose quietly and joined Ranger at the window. He didn't look alarmed. He looked attentive. He stared down the gravel drive where the trees opened to the road. After a moment, he relaxed slightly. "Just a car going by," he said, but his tone carried a thin thread of suspicion, like a wire under a rug. Eleanor watched him for a second too long. Caleb sensed it and turned, offering a calmer expression. "Mom," he said, voice softer now. "I know you want peace. That's why we're here. Cedar Falls is rough around the edges, but it's still a good place. People mind their business." Eleanor sipped her tea, letting warmth spread through her throat. "Sometimes people mind other people's business too much," she said, not accusing, just observing. Caleb didn't deny it. He only said, "We'll keep it simple. Tomorrow we'll go into town, get you settled, find you a diner you like, maybe a little bookstore. I'll show you the Riverside Trail." Ranger returned to his spot near Caleb's boots and sat, calm again, as if the moment of alertness had been filed away for later. Eleanor looked out at the river once more. The clear water kept moving, indifferent to human greed and human grief. It had seen generations arrive, fight, love, and leave. It would see more. Somewhere beyond the trees, Cedar Falls breathed its cold October air. The town didn't know Eleanor yet. It didn't know her quiet backbone, the kind that had carried a marriage through sickness and raised a son who learned to live in shadows. It didn't know Caleb's patience, the kind that looked like calm right up until it didn't. And it certainly didn't know Ranger, the silent guardian who did not bark to announce danger, but listened for it like a prayer. Eleanor set her mug down and gave Caleb a small, steady smile. "All right," she said. "Let's try your piece." Caleb nodded, and for a moment, the cabin felt like exactly what it was meant to be, a refuge. But the wind outside kept testing the trees, and Ranger's eyes, dark, watchful, ancient in their intelligence, kept returning to the window, as if the river had whispered something he couldn't ignore. Morning came to Cedar Falls without ceremony. The sun lifted itself over the ridgeline like a tired promise, pale and sharp, spilling light across the Clearwater River until the surface glittered with cold fire. Frost clung to the grass around the cabin, thin and fragile, retreating slowly as the day warmed. The air smelled of pine sap and iron-rich water, and somewhere deeper in the woods a woodpecker hammered at a dead trunk with patient insistence. It should have felt peaceful. Eleanor Brooks wanted it to feel peaceful. Yet as she stood on the porch with both hands wrapped around a mug of tea, she sensed the way the town was already leaning toward her, listening. Ranger stood at her side, his body angled toward the trees, posture relaxed but attentive. In daylight, his size was even more apparent, long legs built for endurance, chest deep and powerful, head held high with quiet authority. His coat caught the sun in subtle shades of sable and black. He was 7 years old, Caleb. Had told her the night before, retired from service but not from duty. Dogs like Ranger, Eleanor thought, never truly learned how to stop guarding. They only learned whom to guard. Caleb emerged from inside, pulling on a jacket, movements economical as ever. He looked rested in the way soldiers often did after too little sleep, functional, alert, not quite relaxed. "We'll head into town," he said, as if continuing a conversation already underway. "Groceries, a proper look around, let people see you're just here to live." "Let people see," Eleanor repeated softly. She understood that phrase better than he realized. Visibility could be shield or target, depending on who was watching. The drive into Cedar Falls followed the river for a stretch before curving uphill toward the town center. The main street was a tidy line of brick and timber storefronts, many with hand-painted signs that looked older than Eleanor felt. There was a hardware store with a faded American flag fluttering above its door, a second-hand bookstore squeezed between a florist and a closed-down cinema, and a diner with chrome trim that caught the sun like a mirror. Pickup trucks lined the curb, most of them mud-splashed and familiar to one another. Caleb parked near the diner. As Eleanor stepped out, she felt the subtle shift, the pause in conversation, the flicker of eyes that lingered a second too long. No hostility yet, just assessment. Ranger hopped down from the truck bed and sat by Caleb's leg, leash loose in his hand. Inside, the diner smelled of coffee and buttered toast. The bell above the door chimed, bright and almost cheerful enough to be a lie. A handful of locals occupied the booths, men in work jackets and women with weathered faces, all of them pausing just long enough to register the newcomers before resuming their meals. Behind the counter stood Maya Collins. She was in her late 20s, with warm brown skin and thick black hair pulled into a low ponytail that brushed the collar of her denim shirt. She had the build of someone used to being on her feet, strong legs, squared shoulders, and eyes that missed very little. A faint scar cut through one eyebrow, giving her face a permanent hint of skepticism. When she smiled, it was genuine but cautious, like someone who had learned that friendliness could be misread. "Morning," Maya said, her voice clear and steady. "Sit wherever you like." Eleanor chose a booth by the window. As she slid in, Ranger lay down at Caleb's feet, head on his paws, eyes scanning the room without obvious movement. Maya brought menus, her gaze flicking briefly to the dog, then to Caleb, then back to Eleanor. "You're new," she said lightly, not a question. "Just visiting," Eleanor replied. "My son thought I'd enjoy the river." Maya's lips curved. "The river's the best thing we've got. Coffee's decent, too." She poured a mug and set it in front of Eleanor. "On the Saint-Denis house." Before Eleanor could protest, Maya was already moving away, her attention drawn to the door as it opened again. Wade Harlan walked in like a man accustomed to space, rearranging itself for him. He was in his early 50s, tall and broad, his bulk carried heavily through his chest and shoulders. A gray-streaked beard framed his mouth, trimmed but never neat, and his hair was cut short enough to look practical rather than stylish. His face bore the permanent flush of someone who drank too much and slept too little. There was an old break in his nose that had healed crooked, giving him a slightly snarling look, even when he smiled. He wore a heavy work jacket stained with grease and dust, and his boots left faint traces of mud on the diner's clean floor. Wade's eyes swept the room with casual ownership. He nodded to a couple of men in the back booth, construction workers by the look of their calloused hands and reflective vests. Then his gaze landed on Eleanor. It lingered, traveled from her white hair to her composed posture to the way she held her mug with both hands, as if warmth were something to be protected. "Well now," Wade said, voice loud enough to carry, "haven't seen you around." Conversation dipped, not stopped, just softened, like music turned down but not off. Eleanor looked up calmly. "Good morning." Wade stepped closer, hands resting on the back of an empty chair as if claiming it without sitting. "You're staying out by the river, aren't you? New cabin, hard to miss." Caleb's posture shifted almost imperceptibly. Ranger's head lifted an inch. "I'm visiting my son," Eleanor said evenly. Wade smiled, but it didn't touch his eyes. "That's so. Well, folks around here usually talk to me before they buy land like that, just how we keep things neighborly." Maya froze behind the counter, a coffee pot suspended midair. Her jaw tightened. Caleb finally spoke, his tone polite and flat. "The property's paid for. Everything's legal." Wade glanced at him then, really looked, and something in his expression changed. Not fear, but calculation. "Didn't ask you," he said, though his smile stayed in place. "Just making conversation." Eleanor met his gaze without flinching. Years of standing in front of unruly classrooms had taught her the power of quiet authority. "I appreciate the welcome," she said. "But I'm not discussing property over breakfast." For a moment, Wade seemed amused, then his smile thinned. "Suit yourself, ma'am. Cedar Falls likes to know its neighbors." He stepped back, gave a mock nod, and returned to his booth. The room exhaled, conversations resumed, but something had shifted. A line had been drawn, faint but unmistakable. Maya returned to Eleanor's table, lowering her voice. "Ignore him," she said. "He likes to hear himself talk." Eleanor smiled gently. "Thank you." As they ate, Caleb kept his movements. Minimal, but his attention never wavered. He noted which men watched too closely, which ones pretended not to. He noticed Wade leaning back in his booth, one arm draped over the seat, eyes flicking toward the window where Eleanor sat. He noticed Maya slipping her phone into her apron pocket, screen already dark but ready. After breakfast, they walked the length of Main Street. Eleanor stopped at the bookstore, charmed by the owner, a thin, elderly man with spectacles perpetually sliding down his nose, while Caleb waited outside with Ranger. A pickup truck rolled past slowly, its driver staring openly. Caleb memorized the license plate without thinking about it. They ended the morning at the hardware store. Inside, the owner, a stooped man with nicotine-stained fingers, greeted Caleb warmly but regarded Eleanor with open curiosity. "You're the river lady," he said, not unkindly. "I suppose I am," Eleanor replied. By the time they returned to the cabin, the sun had climbed higher, burning off the last of the frost. Eleanor unpacked a few books, arranging them carefully on a shelf by the window. She chose one, a slim volume of poetry, and settled into the armchair, Ranger lying at her feet. Caleb stood at the window again, gaze drifting toward the road. "You okay?" he asked, softer now. "I am," Eleanor said truthfully. "But this town," she searched for the right word, "it watches." Caleb nodded. "It always does." Outside, a distant engine rumbled, then faded. Ranger lifted his head, ears pricked, then settled again. Eleanor placed a hand on the dog's broad back, feeling the steady warmth beneath his fur. She had come to Cedar Falls for rest. Instead, she felt the first tightening of a thread she couldn't yet see, stretching from the diner to the river to the men who believed land and people could be claimed through pressure and patience. And somewhere between the quiet river and the watchful town, something had begun. By the third morning, Cedar Falls had decided how it would greet Eleanor Brooks, not with open hostility, but with pressure, slow, persistent, and cold as the ground before snowfall. The day dawned steel gray, clouds stacked low against the mountains, muting the colors that had dazzled her on arrival. The Clearwater River still moved with patient confidence, but its surface looked darker now, less forgiving. The wind came sharper, slipping under collars and through seams, testing what was sturdy and what was merely decorative. Eleanor felt it while watering the small planter boxes on the porch. It wasn't fear, it was awareness, the kind that arrived when a place began to push back against your presence. Ranger lay nearby, chin on his paws, eyes tracking the tree line and the bend of the road with the same impartial vigilance he had shown since they arrived. Caleb had already left for town, saying only that he wanted to check a few things. Eleanor knew that tone. It meant he was mapping a problem before it announced itself. The first sign came quietly. A white envelope appeared tucked into the cabin's mailbox, its edges damp with morning mist. Eleanor found it when she went down the drive to collect the newspaper she hadn't yet learned she wouldn't enjoy reading. The envelope bore no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper, typed impersonal. Notice of code review. Unpermitted structural modifications may be subject to inspection. No date, no signature, just implication. Eleanor folded the paper carefully and slipped it into her pocket. Thomas had always said that intimidation worked best when it pretended to be procedure. She carried the notice inside and set it on the kitchen counter beside the bowl of apples. The contrast made her smile, fruit and threat sharing the same quiet space. An hour later, a truck rumbled up the drive. Not Caleb's. Ranger was on his feet instantly, body aligned toward the sound, a low sound vibrating. In his chest, not a growl, not quite, but a warning tuned to a frequency Eleanor felt more than heard. The truck stopped short of the porch. Two men got out. One was young, early 20s perhaps, slim and nervous looking, wearing a county vest 2 sizes too big. The other was older, mid-40s, stocky he, with a shaved head and a goatee peppered with gray. He walked with the confidence of someone accustomed to doors opening before he knocked. "Morning," the older man called, voice carrying forced cheer. "County inspection." Eleanor stepped onto the porch, shawl wrapped around her shoulders. "I wasn't aware I'd scheduled one." The man smiled, thin-lipped. "We're proactive around here. Name's Travis Boone." He offered no hand. "This here's Kyle." The younger man nodded, eyes flicking to Ranger and back again. Eleanor inclined her head. "You'll need to coordinate with my son. He owns the property." Boone's eyes slid past her, cataloging the porch, the windows, the slope of the land. "We just need to look around. Won't take long." Ranger stepped forward, placing himself between Boone and the porch steps. He didn't bark. He didn't bare his teeth. He simply stood, muscles taut, gaze locked. Boone hesitated, annoyance flashing across his face before he masked it. "Is that dog going to be a problem?" he asked. "No," Eleanor replied calmly, "but you might be." Boone's smile faltered. "Ma'am, my son will call the county office," Eleanor said. "You can leave your card." Boone stared at her for a long second, then reached into his pocket and produced a card, which he set on the porch rail rather than handing it to her. "We'll be back," he said, and something in his tone made it clear he wasn't talking about inspections. As the truck backed down the drive, Ranger remained where he was until it disappeared around the bend. Only then did he relax, padding back to Eleanor's side. She knelt and ran a hand along his neck, feeling the steady strength there. "Good boy," she murmured, and meant more than obedience. When Caleb returned that afternoon, he brought news that confirmed her instincts. "Sheriff Nolan Pierce asked about you," he said, setting his keys on the counter. "Friendly-like." Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "That sounds ominous." Caleb exhaled. "He's been sheriff here almost 20 years. Former high school linebacker, stayed local, married well." He paused. "He has a reputation for keeping things smooth." As if summoned by the mention, another vehicle appeared near dusk, a black SUV this time, clean to the point of arrogance. It stopped at the edge of the drive, not coming closer. A man got out slowly, hands visible, posture practiced. Sheriff Nolan Pierce was in his late 50s, tall and broad-shouldered, though age had softened him around the middle. His hair was sandy blonde, gone thin, combed carefully. Back. He wore a neatly pressed uniform that looked more ceremonial than practical, the badge on his chest polished to a dull shine. His face was open, almost kind, but his eyes were sharp, measuring. This was a man who smiled often and listened rarely. Caleb stepped onto the porch to meet him. Ranger stood at heel without command. "Caleb Brooks," Pierce said, offering a hand. "Heard you're settling in." Caleb shook it briefly. "My mother's visiting." Pierce nodded toward Eleanor. "Mrs. Brooks, welcome to Cedar Falls." His smile widened. "I like to meet new folks, make sure everyone's comfortable." "That's thoughtful," Eleanor said. "We've been very comfortable." Pierce's gaze flicked to the house, the land, the river beyond. "There's been some confusion," he said lightly. "Code enforcement thought they saw irregularities. I told them to stand down. No need to bother guests." Caleb's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Appreciate that." Pierce clasped his hands in front of him. "You'll hear talk about development, about the river. Folks worry change is coming too fast." He chuckled. "I tell them we can all get along if we're reasonable." Eleanor met his eyes. "Reasonable cuts both ways, Sheriff." Pierce studied her then, really studied her, and something shifted. Interest, perhaps, or irritation. "Indeed it does," he said. "Well, if you need anything, my office is always open." He tipped an invisible hat and returned to his SUV. After he left, the cabin felt quieter than before, as if sound itself were holding its breath. That night, the power flickered once, twice, then steadied. Caleb checked the breaker anyway. Ranger paced the perimeter until midnight, then lay by the door, still as stone. Eleanor slept lightly, dreams tangled with images of frost and footsteps. The next day brought another small cut. The grocery store clerk misplaced Eleanor's credit card for several minutes. A delivery of firewood arrived short by a quarter cord. When Caleb asked about it, the driver shrugged and suggested a counting error. None of it was enough to confront. All of it was enough to feel. By afternoon, Eleanor decided she wouldn't shrink. She walked into town alone, Ranger at her side, and stopped at the diner. Maya was behind the counter again, her expression softening when she saw Eleanor. "They're circling you," Maya said quietly as she poured coffee. "Wade's been asking questions." Eleanor sipped, calm. People ask questions when they want answers they've already decided on. Maya glanced toward the door. "If anything happens, anything, tell me." Eleanor nodded. She recognized courage when she saw it, especially the kind that came without armor. As Eleanor stood to leave, Wade Harlan's truck pulled up outside. He didn't get out. He just sat there, engine idling, watching through the windshield. Eleanor met his gaze, then turned away without hurry. Back at the cabin, she placed the code notice, Boone's card, and the firewood receipt in a neat stack on the table. Evidence, not yet of a crime, but of intent. She felt no panic, only resolve. Caleb stood beside her, reading the room the way others read maps. Ranger sat between them, calm and present. "They're pushing," Caleb said. "Yes," Eleanor agreed, "and they'll push harder." Outside, the wind picked up, bending the treetops toward the river. Cedar Falls had made its choice, not to attack outright, but to test endurance. Eleanor looked at her son and the dog who guarded them both and felt something settle into place. Winter, she thought, teaches you what holds. The weather broke the way tension often did in Cedar Falls, suddenly, without apology. By mid-morning, the clouds that had loitered for days tore open, releasing a hard, cold rain that flattened dust and darkened the streets until the town looked older, more severe. Water ran in thin sheets along the gutters of Main Street, carrying leaves and grit toward drains that struggled to keep up. The mountains vanished behind a curtain of gray, and the clear water swelled, its voice deeper now, less patient. Eleanor Brooks watched the rain from the cabin window, her reflection faint in the glass. Pressure had a way of clarifying priorities. She knew, with a certainty that surprised her by how calm it felt, that shrinking would only teach the town how far it could push. Cedar Falls respected presence, not retreat, so she pulled on her coat, wrapped her scarf carefully, and reached for her handbag. "I'm going into town," she said. Caleb looked up from the table where he'd been, reviewing receipts and notices, the small paper trail of harassment they were quietly collecting. His expression tightened. "I'll come." "No," Eleanor replied gently. "Not this time. I want to be seen as myself, not as a problem with an escort." Ranger stood and moved to her side without being asked, his ears angled forward, his focus immediate. Caleb hesitated, then nodded. "Take him. Call me if anything feels wrong." Eleanor smiled. "I always do." The diner bell rang as she stepped inside, rain dripping from the hem of her coat. The warmth hit her first, the familiar smell of coffee, grease, and baked bread. It was late morning, a lull between breakfast and lunch, but several tables were occupied, men in work jackets, a pair of older women sharing pie, a lone figure at the counter nursing a mug like it held answers. Maya Collins was wiping down the counter, her movements brisk, controlled. She looked up, relief flickering across her face when she saw Eleanor. "You picked a day," she said softly. "I needed the walk," Eleanor replied. "And the company." Ranger lay down beside the booth Eleanor chose, placing himself neatly between her and the aisle. His presence drew a few glances, but no comments. Cedar Falls knew working dogs when it saw them, or thought it did. Maya brought coffee without asking. "You hear about the zoning meeting?" she asked, voice low. Eleanor shook her head. "Moved up? Tonight? Closed session?" Maya's jaw tightened. "Wade's been celebrating." Eleanor took a sip, letting the bitterness ground her. "Then I'm glad I came." The door opened again. The sound of rain followed Wade Harlan in like a bad smell. He wore the same heavy jacket as before, damp now, darkened with water. His beard was thicker than Eleanor remembered, flecked with gray that made him look perpetually unkempt rather than distinguished. His eyes swept the room and stopped on Eleanor with unmistakable satisfaction, as if he'd been hoping for exactly this. "Well," Wade said, loud enough to carry, "if it isn't our river lady." Conversation thinned. Forks paused midair. Someone coughed. Eleanor didn't look up immediately. She finished her sip of coffee, then met his gaze. "Good morning." Wade walked closer, boots leaving wet prints on the linoleum. He rested one hand on the back of her booth, leaning in without invitation. "You get my message?" he asked. "I've received several," Eleanor said evenly. "None of them appropriate." A ripple of quiet discomfort passed through the room. Wade grinned. "You're holding up a lot of folks' plans. That land of yours, prime access to the river, town could use development, jobs." "Coercion isn't development," Eleanor replied. "It's theft with paperwork." That did it. Wade's smile collapsed, replaced by something raw and mean. "You don't get to lecture me," he snapped. "You don't even belong here." Maya stiffened behind the counter. Her hand slid toward the phone she kept tucked beneath the register, screen already lit. Ranger rose slowly, positioning himself closer to Eleanor's knee. The room felt smaller now, air thick and expectant. "Sit down, Wade," called one of the men from the back booth, a contractor with a lined face and tired eyes. "Not worth it." Wade ignored him. "Last chance," he said to Eleanor. "You sell, or this gets uncomfortable." Eleanor stood. She was not tall, not imposing, but there was something unyielding in the way she moved, a lifetime of dignity settling into her spine. "This conversation is over," she said. "Please, step aside." For a heartbeat, Wade seemed stunned. Not by defiance, but by its calm. Then his face flushed deeper, anger overtaking calculation. He swept his arm across the table in a sudden, violent motion. The coffee mug flew, shattering against the wall. Hot liquid splashed. Across the floor, a few drops catching Eleanor's hand. She gasped more from shock than pain and stumbled back. The sound was sharp, final. The diner froze. "Wade!" Maya shouted. Eleanor's heel caught the edge of the booth. The world tilted, and then Wade did the thing that would define him forever. He raised his hand and struck her. The slap cracked through the room like a breaking branch. Eleanor cried out as the force sent her backward, her body folding to the floor. Pain flared along her cheek, bright and disorienting. She lay there, breath knocked from her lungs, the ceiling lights blurring above her. No one moved. Ranger did. He surged forward with a low, controlled growl that vibrated through the diner, placing his body squarely between Wade and Eleanor. His teeth showed, not bared in frenzy, but displayed with deliberate warning. Wade stumbled back a step, surprise breaking through his rage. "Get that dog under control!" Wade barked, fear creeping into Beta. His voice. Maya was already moving, phone held steady, recording everything. Her hands shook, but her aim did not. The bell over the door rang again. Caleb Brooks entered, rain slicking his jacket, eyes scanning the room in an instant. He took in the shattered mug, his mother on the floor, Wade retreating from Ranger's silent snarl. Something in him went utterly still. He crossed the room in 3 strides, kneeling beside Eleanor. "Mom," he said, voice gentle, steady. "Look at me." "I'm all right," she whispered, though her cheek throbbed and her hands trembled. Caleb helped her sit up, his movements precise, controlled. He checked her quickly, eyes darkening as he saw the red mark blooming on her skin. Then he stood and faced Wade. The temperature in the room dropped. "You touched her," Caleb said quietly. Wade tried to recover his swagger. Caleb took 1 step forward. Ranger matched him, shoulder to knee, a perfect alignment of man and dog. "You're done," Caleb said. "Stay where you are." Sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer. Someone had called it in, maybe Maya, maybe a bystander who'd finally found their courage. When Sheriff Nolan Pierce arrived, rain still dripping from his hat brim, the scene was already captured from multiple angles. Phones were out, faces were pale, Maya's camera lens was unwavering. Pierce took 1 look at Eleanor, then at Caleb, then at Wade. "What happened?" he asked, too casually. Caleb didn't raise his voice. "My mother was assaulted." Pierce opened his mouth to speak, but Maya cut in. "It's all on video, Sheriff, every second." Pierce's jaw tightened. He glanced around the room, taking in the witnesses, the dog, the phones. For the first time since Eleanor arrived in Cedar Falls, uncertainty flickered across his face. Outside, the rain eased to a steady whisper. Inside, the town held its breath, and something, long protected by silence, had just been exposed. The rain had stopped by the time the ambulance doors closed, but Cedar Falls remained soaked in the aftermath. Water clung to brick and asphalt, reflecting the diner's neon sign in distorted reds and blues, as if the town itself were bleeding color. Eleanor Brooks lay on the gurney, a thin blanket tucked beneath her chin, her cheek marked by a darkening bruise that felt hotter than it looked. She was alert, composed, answering the paramedics' questions with quiet precision. Shock, she knew, was a liar. Calm came later. After. Caleb rode in the front seat of the ambulance, jaw clenched, hands folded tightly in his lap. He had replayed the moment again and again, the sound of the slap, the way his mother fell, the way Ranger had moved without hesitation. Years of training had taught him how to respond to violence. None of it had prepared him for witnessing it done to her. Ranger followed in the truck driven by one of the diner patrons, a retired firefighter named Glenn. Harper, broad-shouldered, white-haired, and taciturn, a man who looked like he had spent a lifetime running toward danger and now preferred not to talk about it. Ranger sat rigidly in the back seat, eyes forward, as if guarding something invisible but sacred. At Clearwater Regional Hospital, Eleanor was examined quickly. The attending physician, Dr. Hannah Lowell, was a woman in her early 40s with cropped auburn hair and tired, intelligent eyes. She moved with efficiency, her tone calm and reassuring. "You're fortunate," she said, as she shone a light near Eleanor's pupil. No fracture, soft tissue trauma. It will hurt for a few days. I've had worse, Eleanor replied honestly, thinking of grief, of long nights when silence screamed. Dr. Lowell paused, studying her. That may be, she said gently. But this matters too. Outside the examination room, Sheriff Nolan Pierce spoke in low tones to a uniformed deputy, a younger man with a buzz cut and the uncomfortable posture of someone caught between duty and loyalty. Pierce's expression was all practiced concern, but his eyes flicked repeatedly toward Caleb. He approached with careful steps, hands open. Mrs. Brooks, Pierce said, I'm glad you're all right. This kind of thing, it's rare here. Eleanor met his gaze, unflinching. So is accountability, she replied. Pierce smiled thinly. We'll file a report. Wade's been drinking. He'll cool off. Caleb stepped closer, his presence altering the air. He assaulted my mother, in public, on camera. Pierce's jaw tightened. Videos don't always show the full story. From the end of the hallway, Maya Collins appeared, her phone still in her hand. She looked smaller out of the diner's fluorescent light, but her spine was straight. It shows enough, she said. I sent copies. To the county and to myself. Pierce's eyes hardened for a fraction of a second. Miss Collins, he said, voice cool. You should be careful. Posting things like that can have consequences. Maya didn't look away. So does silence. That night, Cedar Falls slept poorly. The video appeared online before dawn, uploaded by a diner patron whose hands shook as he pressed publish. It spread with the inevitability of fire and dry grass. First the county pages, then veteran groups, then national feeds. The comments came fast. Outrage, disbelief, demands for names. By morning, Wade Harlan's name was everywhere. Caleb returned to the cabin with Eleanor late that night. Ranger paced the perimeter, ears catching every sound. The house felt smaller now, no longer a retreat but a position. Caleb set motion lights, checked locks, made calls on a phone Eleanor had never seen him use before. Rugged, encrypted, quiet. You didn't have to come, Eleanor said softly from the armchair, a cold pack resting against her cheek. I always come, Caleb replied. The retaliation was swift and subtle. By noon the next day, Maya was called into the diner manager's office. Howard Fisk, the owner, was a thin man with receding hair and perpetually damp palms. He wouldn't meet her eyes as he slid an envelope across the desk. Corporate policy, he murmured. Unauthorized recordings, the sheriff's office called. Maya laughed once, sharp and humorless. Of course they did. She cleaned out her locker in silence, walking past tables where regulars stared into their plates. Outside, the autumn air felt colder than before. She didn't cry. She called Eleanor instead. Meanwhile, the sheriff's report hit the county log. Altercation, mutual verbal dispute, no charges pending. Wade Harlan was released with a warning. Caleb read the report twice, then once more aloud to his mother. His voice was flat. They're rewriting it, Eleanor nodded. Then we stopped letting them hold the pen. That afternoon, a woman arrived at the cabin, unannounced. She parked at the edge of the drive and walked up alone, rain boots crunching on gravel. She was in her early 50s, tall and composed, with dark hair streaked prematurely with silver, pulled into a low bun. Her coat was expensive but worn, her posture elegant but restrained, as if she had learned to take up less space than she deserved. My name is Evelyn Pierce, she said when Eleanor opened the door. I'm the sheriff's wife. Eleanor studied her carefully. She saw the tension in the woman's jaw, the faint tremor in her hands. This was not a visit of comfort. It was a confession looking for courage. I'm sorry, Evelyn continued, voice tight. For what happened, for what my husband is doing now. Caleb appeared behind Eleanor, silent but unmistakably present. Ranger stood at his side, calm and watchful. Evelyn swallowed. I can't stay long, but I need you to know you're not imagining this. Wade doesn't act alone, Eleanor gestured her inside. They sat at the table, sunlight filtering weakly through the clouds. Evelyn spoke quickly, as if afraid she might lose her nerve. She described zoning meetings held behind closed doors, payments disguised as campaign donations, code inspections used as leverage. Her husband, she said, had changed over the years, once idealistic, now addicted to control. He says it's for the town, she whispered. But it's for power. Why tell us? Caleb asked. Evelyn met Eleanor's eyes. Because what he allowed yesterday crossed a line I can't step back over. She stood abruptly. Be careful, she said, and left without waiting for thanks. That evening, another message appeared online. The video, shared by a former Marine with 500,000 followers. News vans began arriving at the edge of town. Cedar Falls tried to look ordinary. It failed. At dusk, a stone shattered the cabin's front window. Ranger exploded into motion, barking once, sharp and furious, before Caleb had even reached the door. The stone lay on the floor like a punctuation mark. Eleanor stared at it, then looked at her son. Her voice was steady. They're afraid. Caleb nodded. Good. Outside, the river kept moving, and Cedar Falls, having tried to bury the truth, learned what happened when dirt couldn't hold. Cedar Falls woke to headlights and cables. By sunrise, 2 satellite vans idled at the edge of Main Street, their logos bright against the wet pavement. A third arrived an hour later, parking near the courthouse with a deliberate lack of haste. The town pretended not to notice, which only made the noticing louder. Windows stayed closed, curtains shifted, conversations stopped when unfamiliar faces passed too close. At the cabin, Caleb Brooks watched the live feed on a muted tablet while Ranger lay stretched across the threshold like a living barricade. The stone that had shattered the window the night before had been swept away, the glass replaced with a temporary board. Caleb had fixed it before dawn, hands steady, jaw set. He worked the way he always did when the world narrowed to a problem, quietly, completely. Eleanor sat at the table with a notebook open, her handwriting neat and unhurried as she recorded dates, times, names. She had taught children to read music. She knew the value of notation. Memory, she believed, was strongest when anchored to ink. Press is asking for statements, Caleb said, glancing at the tablet. They'll come up the drive if we let them. Eleanor capped her pen. We won't. Not yet. Caleb nodded. He understood the difference between speaking and being heard. A knock came anyway, soft, measured. Ranger lifted his head, ears forward, then settled. Caleb checked the camera feed and exhaled. It's Maya. Maya Collins stood on the porch with a canvas bag slung over one shoulder. She wore a windbreaker a size too big and jeans cuffed at the ankle, her hair pulled back tighter than usual. Her eyes were tired, but there was something new in them too, resolve that had found its footing. I didn't know where else to go, she said as Eleanor opened the door. You came to the right place, Eleanor replied. Inside, Maya set the bag on the table and pulled out a small tripod, a battery pack, and a backup phone. I saved everything, she said. Raw files, timestamps. I uploaded copies to 2 clouds under different names. She met Caleb's gaze. They can't erase it. Caleb inclined his head, respect clear. You did exactly right. The town answered with escalation. By mid-morning, Sheriff Nolan Pierce held a press briefing on the courthouse steps. He stood tall in his uniform, the badge catching light, his voice smooth and practiced. He spoke of unfortunate incidents, of outside agitators, of due process. He did not mention Eleanor by name. He did not mention the video. Evelyn Pierce watched from the back of a coffee shop across the street, her reflection faint in the window. She wore a pale gray coat and gloves she never took off. When the sheriff finished, applause came from a cluster of men near the steps. Contractors, campaign volunteers, faces Eleanor recognized only from description. Evelyn did not clap. That afternoon, a new visitor arrived at the cabin, this one announced by a county sedan and a knock that carried authority without threat. The woman who stepped inside introduced herself as Lila Moreno, an investigator from the state attorney general's office. She was in her early 40s, medium height, with dark hair cut blunt at the shoulders and eyes that measured rooms the way a carpenter measured beams. Her suit was practical, her shoes sensible, her demeanor precise. I'm here unofficially, Moreno said. For now. She listened as Eleanor spoke, occasionally asking for clarification, never interrupting. She watched the video once, twice, then turned to Caleb. Your mother's case doesn't stand alone, she said. We've had complaints from 3 counties upriver, similar patterns. Code enforcement, zoning pressure, intimidation. Why now? Caleb asked. Moreno's mouth tightened. Because someone finally bled in public. She left as quietly as she arrived, promising nothing and implying everything. The pressure found new avenues. That evening, Glenn Harper called from town. "Your truck," he said. "Someone keyed it, deep." Caleb closed his eyes briefly. "Thanks, Glenn." "It's getting ugly," Glenn added. "Folks are scared." "So are the right people," Caleb said, and meant it. As dusk fell, Evelyn Pierce returned, this time through the back path, rain hood up, breath tight. She carried a small black envelope pressed to her chest. Inside were photocopies, ledgers, zoning minutes, handwritten notes in her husband's careful script. She spread them on the table with trembling fingers. "I can't keep pretending," she said. "I won't." Eleanor reached across and covered her hand. "Courage is quieter than people think." Evelyn smiled weakly. "I wish I'd learned that sooner." They were interrupted by the sound of engines. Not the rumble of pickups this time, but the measured hum of something heavier. Through the trees, lights approached. 2 unmarked SUVs, dark and deliberate. Ranger rose, posture alert but controlled. The men who stepped out wore plain jackets and expressions that did not soften when they saw cameras or dogs. One of them, tall and lean with close-cropped hair and a scar near his right ear, introduced himself as Special Agent Marcus Hale. He spoke calmly, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to being obeyed without asking for it. "We're here because lines were crossed," Hale said, "and because someone tried to redraw them." He didn't say FBI. He didn't have to. Inside, the kitchen became a briefing room. Hale listened, asked for files, accepted copies without comment. He nodded once at Ranger, a professional acknowledgement. "Good dog," he said, not smiling. By nightfall, the town knew. Sirens did not wail. No doors were kicked in. Instead, a quiet took hold, deeper, heavier than before. Wade Harlan's trucks disappeared from the highway shoulder. Sheriff Pierce did not come home. Eleanor stood at the window, watching the river slide past the darkened trees. She felt the ache in her cheek, the fatigue in her bones, and beneath it all, a steadiness that surprised her. They had tried to bury the truth with procedure and fear. They had failed. Behind her, Caleb packed away equipment with the care of a man closing a chapter without sealing it. Ranger lay between them, breathing slow and even, the calm center of a widening circle. Cedar Falls would not be the same in the morning. That knowledge settled like frost, sharp, undeniable, and finally, cleansing. Cedar Falls did not wake up to chaos. It woke up to absence. Wade Harlan's trucks were gone from the highway pullouts where they had squatted for years like territorial animals. The construction yard by the old mill stood locked, its gates chained, the yellow machinery behind them silent and exposed, as if stripped of purpose overnight. Even the diner felt different, quieter but not calmer, like a room after an argument where no one was ready to speak first. Eleanor Brooks noticed it in the smallest ways. The way her grocery receipt was suddenly correct to the penny, the way drivers no longer lingered when passing the cabin road, the way the river seemed louder now that the human noise around it had thinned. Change had not arrived with celebration, it had arrived with caution. At the cabin, Special Agent Marcus Hale sat at the kitchen table with Caleb, papers spread between them. Hale had removed his jacket, revealing a lean frame under a plain button-down shirt. He moved with economy, every gesture intentional. The scar near his ear, pale and narrow, pulled slightly when he frowned. A souvenir, Caleb guessed, from a job that had not gone according to plan. "We're moving carefully," Hale said. "This isn't just about Wade Harlan or Sheriff Pierce. This is about pattern, influence, who benefited." "And who still does," Caleb replied. Hale nodded. "Exactly." Outside, Ranger paced the perimeter, nails clicking softly on the porch boards. He stopped at the tree line, nose lifted, testing the wind. 7 years old, still powerful, still precise. Dogs like Ranger didn't forget threats, they cataloged them. In town, the sheriff's office was locked. A handwritten sign taped to the door read, "Closed for maintenance." No one believed it. A county deputy stood nearby, young and visibly uncomfortable, his uniform too stiff on his frame. He answered questions with rehearsed politeness and eyes that darted to the courthouse steps where cluster of reporters waited. Inside the courthouse, Lila Moreno stood before a whiteboard crowded with names and arrows. She had rolled up her sleeves, dark hair tucked behind her ears, revealing forearms marked with faint ink. Notes to herself, Caleb suspected, written and rewritten during long nights. She spoke in a low, steady voice to a small group. Hale, a federal prosecutor named Andrew Klein, and two analysts who typed without looking at their screens. Andrew Klein was in his early 50s, tall, spare, with a face carved by years of disappointing powerful people. His hair had gone gray early, and he wore it close-cropped, his tie perpetually loosened as if formality chafed. He listened more than he spoke, and when he did, his words landed with careful weight. "We have enough for warrants," Klein said. "Not yet for convictions across the board. Timing matters." Moreno tapped the board. "Pierce won't hold, not once he realizes the circle's closing." That realization came sooner than expected. At dusk, Evelyn Pierce called Eleanor. Her voice trembled despite her effort to keep it steady. "He knows," she said. "Nolan knows. I talked." Eleanor closed her eyes briefly. "Are you safe?" "For now." A pause. "I don't think he'll come home." He didn't. Instead, Sheriff Nolan Pierce was found in his office just before midnight, sitting alone in the dark. He did not resist when the federal agents arrived. He didn't speak. He only stared at the badge on his desk as if it belonged to someone else. The arrest was quiet, almost respectful. No sirens, no crowd. But by morning, the news had spread. Cedar Falls gathered in clusters, outside the post office, near the gas station, along the river path, voices low, expressions unsettled. Wade Harlan was taken 2 hours later at a rest stop 60 miles south. He fought, not with strategy, but with panic. It took 3 agents to restrain him, his beard matted with sweat, his bravado gone. As they led him away, he shouted about deals and promises and how none of it would stick. No one answered. At the cabin, Eleanor sat with Maya Collins, the 2 women sharing tea at the kitchen table. Maya's bag lay at her feet, heavier now with borrowed responsibility. She had been offered her job back that morning. She had declined. "I don't think I could work there again," Maya said quietly. "Not after seeing how fast they folded." Eleanor nodded. "Integrity changes a place. Sometimes it also changes where you belong." Maya smiled faintly. "I've been thinking about journalism school." "That," Eleanor said, "sounds like exactly the right kind of trouble." Caleb watched them from the doorway, a mix of pride and worry threading through him. He had spoken to his commanding officer earlier, the conversation brief but decisive, leave extended, indefinite, if necessary. He felt the strange dislocation of a man used to missions realizing. This one did not end with extraction. That afternoon, the town hall opened its doors. An interim administrator arrived from the state, a woman named Ruth Calder, mid-60s, with iron gray hair cut blunt at the jaw and eyes that missed nothing. She wore sensible shoes and carried no illusions. Her reputation preceded her. She cleaned up places others avoided. "We will do this in daylight," Calder said at the first public meeting. "All of it." The room was full. People stood along the walls, some with arms crossed, others clutching folded papers like shields. Eleanor sat in the front row with Caleb and Ranger at her feet. She felt the weight of attention, but it no longer pressed. It anchored. When Calder opened the floor, silence stretched. Then an older man stood, a rancher named Paul Denton, his face weathered, his hands shaking. "They threatened my water rights," he said. "Said permits get lost all the time." Another voice followed. Then another, stories. Spilled out, uneven but relentless. The pattern took shape in the open air, undeniable now. Outside, as the meeting continued, a single figure watched from across the street. A man in his late 30s, narrow-faced, with a trimmed beard and restless eyes. His name was Isaac Reed, a fixer, quiet, adaptable, previously employed by Wade Harlan to smooth edges that should not have been sharp. He had learned early that loyalty was expensive and expendable. Watching the town speak, he understood the math had changed. That night, Reed made a call. Back at the cabin, Caleb checked the perimeter one last time before turning in. Ranger lay near the door, eyes half closed, ears still listening. Eleanor stood by the window, looking out at the river that had carried everything away and brought nothing back. "It's almost over," Caleb said. Eleanor shook her head gently. "It's almost honest." The difference mattered. In the distance, headlights traced the curve of the road, then disappeared. Cedar Falls had crossed a line it could not uncross, and for the first time the ground beneath it was shifting towards something sturdier than fear. Winter announced itself gently in Cedar Falls, not with blizzards or bravado, but with mornings that smelled of clean cold and evenings that asked for lamps to be lit early. Frost traced the edges of the Clearwater River like careful handwriting, and the town learned slowly how to move without flinching. The storm had passed. What remained was the work of living honestly with the damage it left behind. Eleanor Brooks woke each day to a different silence now. It was not the tense hush of a place bracing for impact, but the softer quiet of a community relearning its own voice. From the cabin window, she watched light gather on the river and felt a gratitude that surprised her with its depth. Gratitude for survival, yes, but more than that, for witness. What had happened to her had not vanished into procedure or fear. It had been seen, and seeing, she had learned, was the beginning of repair. Caleb remained longer than he had planned. The extension on his leave came without fuss. A single-clipped message from a superior who understood when duty took unexpected forms. He spent mornings helping Ruth Calder and the interim council review documents, afternoons repairing what had been neglected, fences, signage, a footbridge near the river path. He worked alongside people who had once looked away, and he did so without judgment. Accountability, he believed, did not require humiliation to be effective. Ranger became the town's barometer. Children approached him first, tentative at the beginning, then braver, their hands small against his broad head. He tolerated their affection with the dignified patience of a veteran, tail moving in slow, deliberate arcs. At 7, his muzzle had begun to gray, and his eyes held a calm that came only from having been tested and found reliable. He walked Main Street with Eleanor in the afternoons, a steady presence that reminded people protection did not always arrive with noise. Maya Collins rented a small room above the bookstore, its narrow window overlooking the street. She worked part-time at the library now, cataloging local records while studying for entrance exams she had postponed for too long. Her questions had grown sharper, her listening deeper. She began interviewing townspeople, not for publication yet, she said, but for accuracy. Stories deserve the right order, she told Eleanor. Otherwise, people rearrange them to feel better. Evelyn Pierce moved quietly through the days. She did not return to the house she had shared with Nolan. Instead, she took a modest apartment near the river, furnished sparsely, as if she were still learning what to keep. The trial dates were set. She cooperated fully, her testimony precise, unsparing. Some in town avoided her. Others left folded notes in her mailbox, simple words of thanks written by hands that trembled less than they once had. On a clear Saturday in early December, Ruth Calder called a town gathering. Not a hearing, not a ceremony, just a meeting. The community hall filled with coats and boots, the scent of wool and cold air. Eleanor sat in the second row this time, Ranger at her feet, Caleb beside her. The agenda was brief: a vote on a citizen oversight committee, transparent budgeting measures, and a resolution to preserve the river corridor from private development. When the vote passed unanimously, the room exhaled. Calder nodded once, satisfied. "This isn't the end," she said. "It's a beginning that requires maintenance." Afterward, an older woman approached Eleanor. Her name was Lillian Moore, a retired nurse with silver hair cut short and hands marked by decades of work. "I froze that day," Lillian said, eyes wet but steady. "At the diner. I want you to know. I won't again." Eleanor took her hands. "None of us are defined by our worst moment," she said, "only by what we do after." Outside, the town lingered. Someone brought coffee. Someone else passed around a tin of cookies. The night settled without tension. The river whispered. For the first time since Eleanor arrived, Cedar Falls felt like a place that belonged to itself. In the weeks that followed, Wade Harlan pleaded out. The fixer, Isaac Reed, took a deal that confirmed the shape of the conspiracy and closed doors that had long remained ajar. Nolan Pierce was convicted on charges that read like a ledger of misplaced trust. The sentences were measured. The point, Calder said later, was not spectacle, but correction. Eleanor returned to the cabin one evening to find Caleb standing on the porch with a folded document. He looked thoughtful, not troubled. "I've been offered a posting," he said. "Administrative, Stateside. Eleanor studied his face. Do you want it? He considered the river, the trees, the dog at his feet. I want to stay, he said, for a while. She smiled, relief and pride threading together. Then stay. They celebrated quietly as they had learned to do. A pot of stew, bread warmed in the oven, Ranger asleep near the fire, paws twitching in a dream Eleanor suspected involved long fields and clear commands. Outside, snow began to fall, light tentative flakes that gathered without insistence. On the last afternoon before Christmas, Eleanor walked to the river path with Maya and a small group of children from the library. They carried notebooks and pencils, breath puffing in the cold. Listen, Eleanor told them, write what you hear. The river obliged. As the sun dipped behind the trees, Eleanor felt the ache in her cheek. A memory now, dull and distant. It reminded her of what had been taken and what had been returned. She was not grateful for the pain. She was grateful for the clarity. That night, as lights glowed across Cedar Falls and the first real snow settled into the seams of the town, Eleanor stood by the window once more. Caleb joined her, arm warm around her shoulders. Ranger pressed against their legs, a steady weight. Home, Eleanor said, and meant the word in its fullest sense. Outside, the river carried the winter forward. Inside, the quiet held, and Cedar Falls, finally honest with itself, learned how to breathe. Sometimes, miracles don't arrive with thunder or flashing lights. Sometimes they arrive quietly, in the courage of a woman who refuses to bow, in the loyalty of a dog who stands between fear and harm, and in the moment, a community finally chooses truth over silence. This story reminds us of something we often forget. God does not always remove the storm. Sometimes, He sends strength to stand in it. Sometimes, He sends a protector. And sometimes, He simply opens enough eyes so that evil can no longer hide. In our daily lives, we may never face cameras or headlines, but we all face moments where we can choose fear or faith, silence or kindness, turning away, or standing beside someone who feels forgotten. If this story touched your heart, let it remind you that your quiet choices matter. A gentle word, a helping hand, a willingness to protect those who cannot protect themselves. Please take a moment to share this story with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment below and tell us which moment spoke to your heart the most. And if you believe that love, faith, and courage still have the power to change lives, subscribe to our channel for more stories like this. We pray that God blesses every one of you watching. May He watch over your family, your children, and the animals who depend on human kindness. May He give you strength when you feel small, and remind you that even the quietest life can be part of a miracle. If you believe that light will always overcome darkness, write Amen in the comments below. Thank you for being here. Thank you for believing.